in theory, the whole point of the blockchain is that you don't need anybody to enforce your contracts. Right? In a nutshell, your smart contracts ought to be self-enforcing, and your payments ought to be non-repudiatable, and once you're paid, and once the contract runs, and that's the end of the story. Perfect self-enforcing environment. So why am I standing here? Answer is, a lot of times you'd like the smart contract to control assets in the real world. And assets in the real world exist in a framework that we call jurisdiction. So, here you have your kind of world of smart contracts and all these abstract notions, and then in the real world you've got physical assets which exist in individual countries, and if you want to control those assets using the blockchain, you need to be essentially able to write to the nation state from the blockchain. It's almost like an API call. You take data from the blockchain level, you push it down into the real world, and the nation state enforces your blockchain property rights. That may sound kind of ambitious and a little strange, but whenever somebody says security token, what they really mean is a blockchain token that maps directly onto a nation-state property right, which will then be enforced in real courts. And this we basically call fiat assets. So the next phase in the evolution of the blockchain is the move from working with crypto tools for working with crypto assets to working with crypto tools working in fiat assets. And this is going to be a dramatic transformation, as you've all heard. So let's go through the hows and the whys. Let's start with the whys. So this is where we came from. I have a background in crypto going back into the 1990s. My first year being paid 100% in digital cash was 1999. I was part of the e-gold ecosystem. And from the old days, I know a guy called Ian Grigg, who designed very complex structures around arbitration in the 90s, and brought that work forward over various forms over about 20 years, most recently EOS. Ian has a certain Baroque style. So the whys, right? Right now, the entire e-commerce game, which remember is all fueled by cryptography. If you can't use HTTPS, you can't do e-commerce. So this is all crypto assets, or it's all crypto finance. So all of this money that was made, thin piece of crypto, $3.6 trillion of value generated. At this point, we have not even begun to see the real impact of the blockchain in the real world. We are at the very earliest rippling dawn of e-commerce, because what e-commerce did was it gave you electronic shopping. Right? All of this stuff, it's all electronic retail. You just walk in and you do essentially catalog shopping, and it's still $3.6 trillion worth of value. But it's only operating inside of 20% of the global payments infrastructure. So the other 80% of the money is not going through credit cards, and for the most part, it's not really going through computers. It's going through manual processes where invoices come into companies and somebody rekeys it into a system, and then it goes to a bank and a payment is made there. We haven't really gotten B2B into the e-commerce age yet, because we just haven't had instruments that were sufficiently secure and sufficiently subtle for B2B to work. So all of this is dark matter. 80% of the world's money is being moved around in mechanisms that are basically pre-internet. And it's an enormous pool of value. It's ridiculously enormous. It's not completely outside of our reach either. Right? So you have all of these systems, coming up on the blockchain, which are going to directly interface with these kind of B2B assets. Some of it's B2C, some of it's B2B, some of it's a bit mixed. But there are real blockchain systems that are coming along and beginning to encroach in the real world in ways which have very, very, very concrete results. And there's a kind of representative sample scattered around here. If you guys don't know about SweetBridge, good lord, take a look at SweetBridge. It's one of the most ambitious things I've ever seen. So, the notion that drives all of this work is the basic idea that you could get to all of the transactions which are not possible with a credit card using smart contracts. In practice, maybe only a third of those transactions will go to smart contracts and the rest will require some new technology that doesn't exist yet. But in principle, we're basically just expanding, that blue arc as far as possible into the real world. We just want to grow and grow and grow the percentage of the world's assets which are going over these kinds of systems. And it's not that radical, right? Crypto is how we secured the credit cards. Crypto is how you secure the smart contracts. More or less any kind of future payment system is going to have a backbone cryptographic architecture. And if a little bit of crypto will generate 3.6 trillion, what is a lot of crypto going to do? We shall see. Now, the thing about smart contracts is they're not simple and well behaved, right? Particularly once you're pairing them to a fiat contract. If you see the sort of wiring diagram for HTTPS, there's Alice and there's Bob and there's some guy trying to listen in the middle, and that's the end of the story on HTTPS. When you get to smart contracts, the actual wiring diagrams are incredibly complicated. Why is this contract secure? Well, first we have to talk about shelling points. This is how we do mining and all the rest of that stuff. So the complexity is 100 times what it was for HTTPS. There's a really large hump to get over just in dealing with system complexity before we can get to the good stuff. And I'm not going to go through any of that system complexity, but as we go forward from here, what I want you to be thinking about is basically same kind of thing that happened in e-commerce is going to happen for everything that's B2B. The technical complexity is 100 times higher, which is why it didn't happen years ago. And the faster we can move that, the more of the world's assets will move over the technologies that we have skill with. So, why contracts? Everything in the real world is done by contract. If you want an arrangement between any two companies, even if the actual work is going to be done over an API, the first thing that's going to happen is that somebody's going to sign a contract that has things like terms of service, maybe service level guarantees, all of that sort of stuff. If you don't have contracts, it's almost impossible for businesses to use services. So if the way that somebody uses a service is that they buy some tokens on an exchange and those tokens enable them to do things, good luck figuring out how the Fortune 500 invoices for that. They will eventually figure it out, but it's not going to happen today. In the real world, it all goes through paper contracts, and the sort of in-house counsel, chief legal officer, general counsel types will give you a very hard time if the contracts that they're looking at don't make sense. You can't sell the services into the big guys without contracts. So any smart contract is going to have to go into the Fortune 1000 wrapped in a paper contract. And that arrangement was invented in the 1990s and is called a Ricardian contract. You have a paper contract that specifies the behavior of the smart contract, and then the smart contract automates the execution of the paper contract. And typically this is paired to an external arbitrator that handles disputes, and I'll come to that in a little more detail. So the way that we want to achieve this large-scale transformation is Ricardian contracts. What Mattereum does is we do Ricardian contracts for people with domain expertise. So somebody comes with a blockchain logistics startup, they come to us for the very nasty, evil, difficult technical bit of just making sure that the paper contracts and the smart contracts and all the rest of that stuff hold together. You saw Hartedge talking about this kind of stuff earlier on. Exactly that set of problems. He comes at it more from a technical side, we come at it more from a legal side. So, I've talked a little about the complexity. The fragility is even more important than the complexity. So you have your value kind of sitting here nicely in the blockchain world as representations of value. In the real world, you have the hard assets. To get a message from the blockchain world into the real world to change the ownership of an asset on a state register, like a house, right? You have to be able to trigger a long sequence of transactions in the real world which will faithfully synchronize the real world property registers held inside of governments with the blockchain property registers that you want to do the transfers on. And if any single link breaks, any of the technology, any of the law, or the extremely fiddly interfaces between the tech and the law, if any of that cracks, value leaks out. And although we haven't seen this happen at scale yet, in all probability, the worst kind of value leaks that you will get are where you make a non-repudiatable payment in the blockchain world, and then somebody in the real world refuses to hand over the assets and says, sue me. And then you wind up in small claims court, or with a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, attempting to prove what the contract was that you existed between you and the person with the assets, and where they breached the contract and where your payment went, in an instrument that a court may not even recognize as a payment, in a jurisdiction like East Texas. It's very, very, very fiddly to get hold of the assets in the real world using the blockchain. It's a very important problem. So we talked about fiat assets. Claims on fiat assets. So all of your blockchain contract stuff basically refers to a set of legal claims on an underlying set of physical assets. And I say physical assets, what I really mean is assets whose existence is defined by the nation-state systems in its courts. Proving that the assets exist and proving that the assets are not owned by anybody else other than the person that put them on the smart contract is very difficult. If we take one of these chairs and we decide that we're going to move the ownership around of that chair with a smart contract, where do we have to check to figure out whether anybody already owns that chair? Right? There's no register of assets. We'd have to basically infer from the fact that it's in this room that it probably belongs to the people that own this boat. But if it actually turns out that they rented the chair is actually owned by somebody else, there's just no way of indexing physical property to figure out who owns it. So before you load any kind of assets into these kind of blockchain systems, you have to get to the bottom of the custody problem to make sure that you actually own the asset, even before you try and tie the asset into the blockchain. So there's a horrendous murkiness in the real world that we have to basically cut our way through before we can get to the kind of clean, safe, simple, easy world that we want, where you do a transaction and it just works. And all of that mess, right, getting a clear legal claim on the assets, figuring out how the tokenization works such that all those rights are clearly legally instantiated, so that whatever your smart contract does, you can point to exactly what the legal process is that's in play. And then making sure that you've got the ability to actually enforce it in the real world if something goes wrong. All of that stuff has to get built in before we can get to the kind of smart contract cryptographic wonderland that we all want to get to. And it's not necessarily so hard for financial instruments, but I'm seeing a lot of companies coming to do things like tokenized real estate, and they're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of assets. That sort of stuff, all of these things become extremely important, because if somebody has a house that they're currently living in, and you attempt to evict them from their house because they haven't made a payment in Bitcoin to a smart contract that's running on some kind of fork, how are we to know that this is the correct thing? Right? It's very hard to synchronize the digital and the physical because the physical is incredibly complicated and very murky, but it's also the place where all of our real assets live. Okay, so let's talk about enforceability. Now, enforceability is a very different thing from legality, right? Compliance tells you that you're allowed to do something, right? You've done the compliance on your security token. We agree that it is compliant. Fine. So now you have a pool of assets. They're all carefully linked together. Everything is where it ought to be. Everything is very happy. Then somebody physically steals the underlying asset. You've securitized the Lamborghini. Somebody nicks the Lamborghini. And now the tokens, which are all exactly where they were supposed to be, there hasn't been a technical breach, now bind to nothing. Now in that situation, typically what arises is a lawsuit, right? I have these tokens, they're meant to bind a Lamborghini, I would like to sue somebody. In a decentralized system, who's catching the liability? The token issuer may be like, well, look, I was just hired to issue the tokens, I never owned the Lamborghini. You could have some notion that there's a company that owns the Lamborghini, but what's the relationship between that company and the token holders? Are the tokens shares in that company? Are they some kind of proprietary right? This is extremely fiddly. And physical possession is, at the end of the day, most of the law. So if somebody either refuses to hand over the goods or inappropriately takes the goods, you wind up having to go to a court with a bunch of evidence from a blockchain and claiming that somebody has stolen something that you own because of a set of digital signatures on a piece of software. And it's not like we can look at the car to figure out what property register it is that the car is currently controlled by, because everybody assumes it's going to be controlled by the government's property registers. And there are fixes for this problem, but they're pretty esoteric and they're not easy to explain, because we're working with the full bandwidth complexity of the real legal situation rather than the very polite abstraction that we get in the blockchain. And it's that ability to dig right down into the enforcement layer in a way which is cheap enough that you can actually use it relative to the assets that you have in play that is the difficult problem. My suspicion is that over the next probably 20 years, we will wind up with global systems to do this kind of property rights enforcement on an economic basis. And these things will look a bit like the Visa chargeback system. Originally, Visa was a non-repudiatable payment. You paid, the money went, that was the end of the story. They had to campaign jurisdiction by jurisdiction by jurisdiction for the right to perform the chargeback where they pulled the money back out of your account. Initially, that just wasn't legal in most places. It was crazy that a payment provider could do that. And they had to literally campaign jurisdiction by jurisdiction by jurisdiction for changes of law to enable the credit card processing system to work. So that model where we start building out the infrastructure of enforcement so that it's possible to take a change on the blockchain and render it all the way down to a physical change in the real world, this is the next big challenge. And that challenge is epochal, right? I mean, that is a really very serious transformation in the way the world works. It involves nation states doing things like updating the way they store their property registers. It involves things like new legislation in some jurisdictions. It involves building of commercial services which will handle these kinds of risks. All of that architecture has to be built out before we get the ability to do what we really want, which is take assets in the physical world and move them around on chain. Now, we don't have to build all of that on day one, but you just have to understand that this is a jurisdiction by jurisdiction, contract by contract, asset class by asset class process. You take the assets that you're interested in, you figure out the enforcement mechanisms, you figure out the jurisdictions the assets are going to be in, and you methodically work your way through making sure that for every asset that you're playing with, you have the necessary enforcement engineering done. Because otherwise, the blockchain says one thing, the real world says another thing, the court will not reliably synchronize the real world to the condition of the blockchain, and you wind up with a delamination error. The blockchain says the assets are there, and in the real world, the assets aren't there, and all the guarantees that you want to make about things on the blockchain just evaporate, as if they were never there. Okay, right. So we talked about enforceability. Integrated contract engineering. So this is fundamentally what we do. Right? And in a second, I'm going to show you a bit of a video that basically puts the bells and whistles on this, because you're a pretty technical audience. I'm not giving you any of the kind of marketing flim-flam on this stuff. I'm giving you the very straight, hard take on what it is that needs doing for these things. It's the synchronization of the domain knowledge, the lawyers, and the coders that produces the smart contracts. External to this, you then need enforceability mechanisms. You have to design it for enforceability, but then you also have access to mechanisms of enforceability, which is where the courts of arbitration come in. So commercial arbitration courts handle billions of dollars a year of disputes, and the reason you don't hear about it very much is that normally these proceedings are confidential. So the parties will take a dispute to an arbitrator, the arbitrator will make a ruling, and because the arbitrator is named in the contract, the ruling is seen as being part of the contract and the entire thing is managed as contract law. All of the stuff to do with maritime is handled this way, oil rigs, boats with holes in them, all of that stuff is handled this way. Construction in the US has run on this basis since maybe the 1990s for the most part. These are very big, well-known systems. The New York Convention on Arbitration in 1958 makes the awards made by arbitrators have the same force as local law in about 150 countries. So what this allows for is a theoretical model where you take contracts, you take arbitrators, you bind the arbitrators to the contracts, and then when your blockchain goes wrong, an arbitrator who is expert in dealing with technical disputes comes along and catches the problem. Is everybody aware of the current round of EOS shenanigans? So EOS is an arbitration system which is based on Ian's models. I think they did a somewhat complicated implementation of them. You'd have to ask Ian for the details. But that arbitration model, because it didn't have sufficiently heavy arbitrators, is coming under some pressure. You know, what you want is people with a couple of decades of experience arbitrating cases for way more money than the cases that you're dealing with. And at that point, they will generally be believed when it comes to enforcement. If you have an arbitrator who seems like they don't know what they're doing, it hugely increases the chance that a local judge will choose not to enforce the contract, at which point your assets evaporate and you can't get them back. Okay, so the last part of this is it's simple in that you don't have to get legislative change, right? For the most part, if you're working with assets which are well understood in jurisdictions where the law works properly, it ought to be possible most of the time to get everything done without requiring legislative change. If you get legislative change, it will be much better. If you're working in countries that have weak legal systems, you definitely might need more support to get these things done. But, simple classes of assets which are well understood or complex assets which have enormous volume in the G20, without any legislative changes, smart contracts can be made enforceable. It just requires an enormous amount of very fiddly work. We usually call it the watchmaking. That's the synchronization of all the different parts so the thing actually meshes properly, and you don't have your assets leak out from a hole between the contract and the law. Right, so that's that. How are we doing for time? We're okay for time? Yep. So I want to show you about a minute of a video, and then I want to talk a little bit about the gap between the story that we tell, the whole blockchain vision, and the actual practical implementation details. Could we run the video?
What would business on the blockchain look like? Smart contracts open up a vast new space for automation, not just for money and digital assets, but also physical assets, intellectual property, and services. The potential market is huge, but how do you connect code with physical assets? What happens when there's a bug or when real-world circumstances change in ways we didn't expect? To put business on the blockchain, we need the right legal and technical foundations to support it. This is what Mattereum provides with its platform for decentralized commercial law. By combining smart contract code with the necessary legal terms, business can be automated while ensuring the correct interpretation of everyone's obligations when something goes wrong. Take a container of goods sailing from China to Europe. A smart contract records its movement from factory to shipping agent to customs officer to warehouse, automatically generating relevant documents and paying fees and taxes. But if something goes wrong along the way, the shipment is delayed or the goods are not what was expected, that's where you'll be glad the contract was built on Mattereum. With decentralized dispute resolution, claims big and small can be resolved fairly and efficiently by independent, technically competent arbitrators. And national courts can enforce their decisions wherever the businesses and assets are located, in more than 150 countries.
So this
With
kind
Mattereum,
of vision,
commercial agreements can be made
where
with confidence.
everything just seamlessly clips together and everything is bolted together end to end and everything works perfectly. This is the long-term view, right? And there are probably 50, 100 companies who are building different parts of that picture. David from Sweetbridge is over there. Do you want to give people a wave? So, what those guys have is enormous amounts of expertise in trade finance, and if you give them a nicely bolted together underlying system, they can lend money at incredibly low prices because they've got super precise understanding of all this stuff. And you go to, the people that are going to put, blockchain-based logistics systems together where it'll track the boxes and so on. All of these pieces are basically different parts of the same vision. So if you go back to the 1990s when people were first selling the internet to each other, they would tell stories about the information superhighway and all the information would be available at your fingertips, and it was this kind of magical vision. And in practice, you do get some approximation of the magical vision, but it's made of a whole bunch of different pieces built by a whole bunch of different people, basically duct-taped together with contracts and goodwill. And I don't think the evolution of the blockchain into the real world is going to be any different. I think what you're going to see is lots of interlocking systems with different areas of expertise connected together using some combination of legal agreements, interchain protocols, and goodwill. And what will come out of that is a situation where you really can email people money and directly order extremely complicated multi-party commercial processes into existence, and then have them generally work kind of 95% of the time. That world is very different from this world, but if you think about the beginning where we talked about how much money was on the table, you're talking about on the order of 50 trillion of assets in the commercial supply chain. Right? This is an enormous transmission of wealth. The money going through commerce is literally 50 trillion a year, and most of that is not going over the internet in any recognizable form. So there's all of that, and then underlying that, and this is all the stuff from Sweetbridge, right? These are Scott's numbers. All underlying that, there's a 700 trillion pool of priced assets. all the houses, all the cars, all the land, all the stocks, all the shares, all the everything else, most of which is not digitally addressable in any way, shape, or form. You can't just reach out and touch that stuff. So in the long run, everything in the world gets a name, it gets an address, it gets an ability to go out there and buy it and sell it and lend it and contract it and so on. And you wind up making matter as easy to access as information is. And this is the long-term trajectory that we are on. All of the convergences point towards this goal. This is why Mattereum is called Mattereum. In the long run, it's the interface to matter from digital systems. The blockchain is the first part of that vision, but in the long run, we'll use whatever technology it is that will get the job done. And I think it's probably going to take 5 years before there's a really good, well-grounded understanding that that's the inevitable trajectory. It will take people a while because things like Internet of Things have gotten off to a slow start, but we're inevitably going to get there. I mean, this is the shape of the future. So that was it. Thank you.
Thank you.